Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. It begins with a silence. Not the comforting kind, but the silence of a place abandoned long before you arrived. A broken swing creaks in the wind, a rusted mailbox leans at the edge of a dirt road, and beyond it, what's left of a house that looks more like a skeleton than a home. Inside those walls, a child once came into this world. Not a child celebrated, not a child wanted by many, but a child whispered about for generations. His name has been buried, altered, and erased, but the story of his birth has never left. This is the story of America's most inbred child, born without knowing a father. A boy whose very existence raised questions no one dared to answer. Was he the victim of neglect, cruelty, or something much darker, something inherited from bloodlines that should never have crossed? The townsfolk who remembered him never spoke of him directly. They said only fragments, piecing together half-truths from memory and fear. He had the eyes of someone older than he should have been. His face wasn't like the others. His laughter, it didn't sound right. They never said his name, as though to speak it would breathe life back into something cursed. Every town has its shadows, but this shadow did not come from an outsider, a stranger, or a threat from beyond. It came from within. From a family that turned inward on itself, generation after generation, until the lines blurred and the branches of the family tree twisted into knots. And from that knot, he was born. What makes this story so haunting is not just the boy himself, but the silence that followed him, the way a whole community knew but chose to look away. They treated his life not as a tragedy to be mourned, but as a secret to be buried. And yet, secrets have a way of rotting beneath the surface. They always leave a smell. As we peel back this story tonight, remember, this is not a tale of monsters, it's a tale of people, ordinary Americans, and the question you must ask yourself is simple. How close are we really to bloodlines like his? The family at the center of this story never asked for attention. They lived at the edge of town, past the gravel road that most people didn't bother to travel. Their house was a patchwork of repairs, each piece of wood nailed over another like scars covering an old wound. Generations had lived and died in those walls, and almost no one new ever entered. People in town used words like odd, strange, or simply different when they described them, but those words never told the whole story. They were a family bound, not just by name, but by blood in ways that blurred the natural order. Cousins who weren't just cousins, uncles who were something more, mothers who were also sisters. No family tree could fully capture it, because the roots were tangled too tightly together. Out of that tangle came a boy. No father listed on his birth record, no photographs taken in the hospital. He was delivered at home, in silence, with only relatives watching. Even before he could speak, people whispered about him. They said he had an unusual way of staring, as if he knew things children shouldn't know. His body grew slower than others, his words came late, and his presence unsettled those who met him. Children who lived nearby sometimes saw him at the edge of the woods. He rarely joined their games, and when he did, he struggled to keep up. They would whisper cruel things. He doesn't have a dad. He's not right. He's cursed. Even at that age, he became the target of something he could never control. He was not guilty of what created him, but he carried the burden as though it was carved into his face. The adults didn't treat him much better. Some avoided him, pretending not to see when he walked by. Others gave him looks of pity that were sharper than cruelty. The truth is, no one wanted to be reminded of how he came into the world, because to acknowledge him meant acknowledge it, and what the family had done, and what had been allowed to continue for so long. In America, we like to believe that every child has a story that begins with hope, but his story began with silence, shame, and secrecy. And the deeper you look into his life, the more you realize The silence wasn't just around him, it was inside him too. As the boy grew older, the silence around him thickened. In most families, birthdays mark milestones, cakes, candles, and photos to capture a child's growth, but for him, there were no celebrations, no snapshots of happiness to hold on to. Time passed without notice, as though each year he lived was something his family wished had never come. His mother, if you could call her that, rarely spoke of him. She treated his existence like an inconvenience, something to be endured rather than cherished. In the small towns of America, gossip is currency, and her silence only fueled the rumors. Who was the father? Why wouldn't she say? The truth lingered in whispers. Perhaps the father wasn't a stranger at all. Perhaps he was someone who shared her blood. The boy became a ghost in his own home. He wandered through rooms filled with dust and peeling wallpaper, spaces that felt more like tombs than living quarters. At night, he would sit by the cracked window, staring out into the fields. Some said they saw him out there, under the moonlight, rocking back and forth as though he was listening to voices only he could hear. There were things about him that people noticed but refused to talk about directly. His features were not symmetrical, his jaw seemed slightly off, his eyes never quite aligned. When he spoke, his words carried a strange lilt, like a song sung out of tune. And yet, what unsettled people most was not how he looked or sounded, but the way he carried himself, like someone who was always on the outside of life, never fully belonging to the world he had been born into. Teachers at school tried to help, but most gave up. He fell behind quickly, not because he lacked the desire to learn, but because he couldn't hold on to the lessons the way other children could. He would forget things, repeat himself, drift off into long silences. Some classmates laughed, others simply moved away from him in fear, as though being near him might make them cursed too. It is easy to dismiss him as an oddity, a product of unfortunate choices, but when you look closer, you begin to see the darker truth. He was a child carrying generations of mistakes inside him. His life was not just his own, it was a mirror of everything his family had tried to hide. By the time he reached adolescence, the boy had already become a local legend, though not in the way most children dream. He was spoken of in hushed tones, the kind of conversations parents had when they thought their kids weren't listening. Stay away from that family. Don't play near their land. The warnings were never direct, but always heavy with implication. Yet the boy wasn't dangerous, he wasn't violent, and he never sought to harm anyone. What unsettled people was something far more primal. He was a reminder of what happens when lines are crossed that should never be crossed. He was the living evidence of a family that had turned inward for too long, producing a child that looked like the past itself, twisted, fractured, and unable to move forward. He rarely left home, but when he did, people remembered it. They remembered the way he stood at the back of church gatherings, quiet and out of place. They remembered how he sometimes appeared at the general store, eyes downcast, clutching a handful of coins for bread or sugar. And they remembered how, no matter where he went, he seemed to draw silence with him. Conversations stopped when he entered, people looked away, children pulled at their mothers' sleeves. What makes his story especially haunting is that no one tried to save him. There were chances, teachers, preachers, neighbors, but each one chose to look away. Perhaps it was fear of getting too close to the family's secret. Perhaps it was easier to let him fade than to confront the generations of choices that had created him. And so the boy became invisible, even as he walked in plain sight. He drifted through his teenage years like a shadow on the edge of photographs, always there, but never fully acknowledged. To some, he was a figure of pity. To others, he was a curse. But to himself, he was simply lost, a child who never knew a father, never felt pride in his name, and never found a place in the world beyond those crumbling walls. The tragedy of his life is not just what he endured, it's the silence of those around him, because silence, in the end, can be as cruel as violence, and his silence, combined with theirs, became the cage he could never escape. There is a moment in every story where silence can no longer protect the truth. For this boy, that moment came quietly, almost unnoticed, like a whisper carried by the wind. The older he became, the more people began to question, not out of curiosity but out of unease. Who was he really? What blood ran through his veins? And why had the family worked so hard to keep the answers buried? By then, the boy's differences had become more pronounced. His body did not grow in balance. His shoulders sloped forward, his hands shook at times, and his speech came in broken rhythms. To outsiders, he looked like someone marked by misfortune, but to those who knew the family's history, his very appearance told a deeper story, one written into his flesh long before he was born. The whispers grew louder, spreading beyond the town, drifting into neighboring communities. People who had once ignored the family now spoke of them with fascination and fear. They said the boy's father was not a stranger, but someone who shared the same roof. They said the boy was proof of sins that had festered for generations, and though no one dared to confirm it aloud, the rumors carried the weight of truth. It's here we must pause. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have hidden it, or would you have tried to break free from it? The boy never had that choice. His fate was written before he even opened his eyes. He lived in the shadows of decisions made long before his birth, trapped inside a cycle of silence and shame. And yet, he carried on. He walked the dirt roads, he showed up in town, and in his own quiet way, he endured. That endurance made him both pitiful and haunting, because every step he took was a reminder of what had been allowed to happen. His story is not a ghost tale, but it haunts all the same. It's the kind of story grandparents refuse to tell, the kind of secret towns bury under layers of forgetfulness, but the truth has a way of clawing its way back, no matter how deep you bury it. And in his life, the truth was written on his very body. As the years passed, the boy's life seemed to shrink instead of grow. Opportunities that most young men take for granted, friendships, work, even love, never truly came to him. He lived on the margins, surviving but never thriving, as though the world itself had decided he wasn't meant to belong. He would sometimes appear in town as a young adult, wandering the edges of community life. But by then, the townspeople no longer saw him as a boy. They saw him as a symbol, a living reminder of what happens when silence is allowed to fester into rot. Mothers warned their children not to stare, fathers shook their heads in quiet disapproval, and all the while, the family's secret remained locked behind closed doors. Some say he developed strange habits. He would talk to himself, pacing in circles for hours. Others claimed they saw him sitting at the edge of the woods, staring into the trees as if waiting for something or someone that would never come. Whether these stories were true or exaggerated hardly matters, because in towns like these, perception often becomes reality, and his reality was isolation. What unsettled people most was not just his presence, but the way he carried history with him. Every gesture, every glance seemed to echo the sins of his ancestors. He was not judged as an individual, but as a culmination of choices made long before his time. He had become the family's legacy, a legacy etched in bloodlines that refused to stretch outward. And yet, buried in the unease, there was also pity. Some neighbors quietly admitted that the boy was never cruel, never violent, never deserving of the stigma placed upon him. He was a victim of circumstance, born into a cage he never built. But pity is not the same as compassion. Pity looks from a distance. Compassion steps forward, and in his story, no one ever stepped forward. His life became a quiet tragedy, an existence more endured than lived. And what makes this story so haunting is that it didn't just end with him. His presence forced the town to confront a question they never wanted to face. How many other secrets, how many other children had been hidden away before him? In the end, the boy's story did not close with a dramatic revelation or a sudden escape from his fate. It ended the way it began, in silence. No obituary printed, no photographs preserved, no grave carefully marked. He slipped out of the world the same way he had entered it, hidden, unacknowledged, and forgotten by nearly everyone except those who whispered his name in secret. But his story lingers, like a shadow cast over the town that raised him yet never claimed him. For the people who lived nearby, he became less of a memory and more of a warning. Parents told their children not to wander too far. Teenagers dared each other to walk past the family's property at night. And older folks, when pressed, would shake their heads and say only, "Some things are better left alone." The haunting truth is that his life was not an accident. It was the inevitable outcome of generations that chose silence over truth, secrecy over accountability. He was born into a family tree that had twisted in on itself for too long, and by the time he arrived, the roots were too tangled to untangle. His existence was both a tragedy and a testimony. And though the town tried to bury him, though the family tried to erase him, his story still rises, because stories like his cannot truly die. They remain, lingering on the edges of history, waiting to be found by those willing to look closer. They remind us that the past is never as distant as we want it to be, and the sins of silence always leave their mark. Perhaps that is why people still speak of him in hushed tones, as though he might appear again at the edge of the woods, staring out with eyes that saw too much. Perhaps that is why his story still unsettles us, because it forces us to confront a truth about humanity itself. When families close their doors and turn inward, when shame is buried instead of confronted, it is not the past that Saberdon offers. It is the children yet to come. So remember him, not as a monster, not as a myth, but as a boy who carried generations of silence inside him. A boy who never knew a father, never heard his name spoken with pride, and never had the chance to step beyond the cage built for him. His story may be buried in a forgotten town, but now you know it. And once you know a story like this, you can never unknow it.